Hello everyone, and welcome to my afternoon tea. Today we are diving into the most controversial of Jane Austen's novels, Mansfield Park, first published in 1814. Why is it controversial, you ask? Well, you'll just have to wait and see. But first, make sure you have something to drink, to eat, make yourself comfortable, and let's get into it. It all started with three sisters, Lady Bertram, Mrs. Norris, and Mrs. Price. Now, Lady Bertram was the wife of Sir Thomas Bertram, baronet and owner of the grand estate Mansfield Park. Mrs. Norris and her husband were living on the property in a parsonage, and these two sisters were very close. The same could not be said for the third sister, Mrs. Price. As punishment for her decision to marry a man of low income, she had become estranged from the rest of the family and did not speak to them for many years. But then, as she was pregnant with her 9th child and was running out of money, she wrote to her sisters asking for their help. They provided her with clothes and things, but it was also decided that the eldest daughter of the Price family would come and live with the Bertrams at Mansfield Park and be raised with their children. It would mean one less mouth to feed for the Prices, and the girl would be offered a better education. So it was decided, and Fanny Price, at the age of 9 years old, was sent to live with her aunt, Lady Bertram, and her family, which included her husband, 2 sons, and 2 daughters. As can be imagined, Fanny wasn't very happy about leaving her family. She came to Mansfield Park with sadness in her heart, and it wasn't made better by the 2 Bertram sisters, Maria and Julia. Even though they were of a similar age, they found her stupid and wanted nothing to do with her. The eldest of the Bertram children, Tom, was 17 and lived a rather frivolous life, but the younger brother, Edmund, quickly became Fanny's favorite. He gave her more attention and kindness than anyone else in the family, and even though Fanny missed her own brother back home, Edmund became a good substitute. The years go by, and Fanny is now 18, and her time at Mansfield Park has been equally as beneficial as it has been tragic. She wasn't treated as part of the family. In fact, she was very undervalued and neglected. The 2 Bertram girls, Maria and Julia, were of course given plenty of opportunities. They went to balls and dinners and were out in society, and it didn't take long before Maria got engaged to a wealthy neighbor. But as for Fanny, she was never invited anywhere. This only enforced Fanny's feelings of inadequacy, and she became a people pleaser who would always put the feelings of others above her own. The only one who seemed to care about Fanny and her well-being was Edmund. He personally nurtured her education and even traded one of his own horses for a gentle mare more suitable for Fanny to ride, as she so rarely got to borrow one of the Bertram sisters' horses. But overall, Fanny's life wasn't that exciting. As her aunt, Lady Bertram, was a hermit, Fanny would simply stay at home with her whenever the rest of the family went out, and thus became the companion of a dull, middle-aged woman who rarely left the house. That summer, Mansfield got some interesting visitors. It was the brother and sister of a neighbor named Henry and Mary Crawford. Now, the Crawfords became an instant success, and Mrs. Grant, who was the sister of Henry and Mary Crawford, immediately began hoping that Henry would marry Julia Bertram and her sister Mary would marry Tom, the eldest Bertram brother, who was of course the heir to Mansfield Park. So the Crawford siblings began socializing with the Bertrams, and for a time, Mrs. Grant's scheme seemed to be working. Tom was chatting a lot with Mary, and Henry was popular with both Maria and Julia. At a dinner one night at Mansfield Park, Mary was seated by Edmund as his older brother was away on some business. This is when both Edmund and Fanny noticed something off about Mary. Just something in her manner that felt improper, and they didn't like it. At this dinner, Henry makes the acquaintance of Mr. Rushworth, who is Maria Bertram's fiancé. And Rushworth is talking about how his own estate is in need of some improvements, and Henry Crawford, having some experience in this regard, offers to help with his input. Edmund's opinion of Mary was about to change, though, once he spent more time with her and listened to her play the harp. He was in fact so smitten that he began prioritizing Mary's wants and needs over Fanny's. He spent more time with her, let Mary use Fanny's horse and things like that, and this was very hurtful to Fanny. The pattern of Edmund prioritizing Mary Crawford over her continued. The day had arrived when Henry Crawford was to evaluate Mr. Rushworth's estate, and the Bertrams and Crawfords decided to make a little day trip out of it. And even Fanny was included this time, but only because Mrs. Grant decided to stay behind to keep Lady Bertram company. While at the Rushworth estate, the party split up into different groups as they were walking around the gardens, and Fanny, Edmund, and Mary Crawford formed a group. Mary and Edmund then got into a slightly heated discussion on Edmund's plan to become a clergyman. She had only just found out that Edmund planned on getting ordained once his father, Sir Thomas, returned from his business abroad, which would be in a couple of months. And Mary did not like it. She made it abundantly clear how this profession was beneath him, and Edmund made it equally as clear that this wasn't a choice of necessity. He wasn't forced to join the church. He wanted to be a clergyman. As much as Fanny enjoyed the outing, she ended up witnessing some unpleasant behavior. Firstly, when she needed to rest, Edmund left her alone to walk off with Mary. Not very nice. But then she also saw some jealousy brewing between her cousins, Maria and Julia, in regards to Henry Crawford. These sisters, who had previously been very close, were now acting like rivals. And poor Mr. Rushworth, Maria's fiancé, also noticed Maria's preference to Henry. Shortly after all of this, a letter arrives at Mansfield Park from Sir Thomas Bertram, who were at that point in the Caribbean on business. He was scheduled to come home that autumn, which would mean two things. One, that Maria and Rushworth would get married, and two, that Edmund would take orders to become a clergyman. But all of that was still a couple of months away. Tom, the eldest Bertram's son, eventually returned to Mansfield Park, and as he did, he'd brought a friend. Mr. Yates was his name, and he was a theatre man of some sort. And with his influence, it didn't take long before several of the Bertram family got into the idea of setting up a play of their own right there at Mansfield Park. They would act in it themselves, and it would all be a jolly time. So a curtain was commissioned, and a carpenter was employed to turn Sir Thomas's billiard room into a theatre. And for a while, this play went on to cause some drama even off stage. The Bertram sisters, Maria and Julia, were interested in the same part, which was the love interest of Henry Crawford's part. I mean, of course, they're both smitten by him, but he vouched for Maria to have it, thus making Julia incredibly jealous. She stormed off and wanted nothing more to do with either him or the play. Fanny was observing all of this and found Henry Crawford to be quite wicked for playing her cousins against each other like that. Besides, why favor Maria when she was already engaged? And her fiancé was witnessing all of this too. It's just not how a gentleman would behave. Fanny and Edmund were both quite comfortable up on their high horses and disapproved of the play from the start. However, when Mary's part needed to cast a love interest, Edmund found himself persuaded, much to Fanny's despair. And as rehearsals began, those feelings increased to a worrying degree. Yes, Fanny had some inappropriate attachment to her cousin Edmund. And when the day came for Edmund and Mary to rehearse a love scene, she was not a happy camper. She took refuge in the old schoolroom, which had become her personal sitting room since no one else in the house was using it. And much to her despair, both Edmund and Mary came up to her, asking for her help in rehearsing the scene. So she watched them rehearse it, all alone, and it was rather awkward. The night then came when the party was to rehearse all scenes together on the stage, and there was a general mix between vexation and excitement. But just as all of this was starting, Julia burst into the room with the important news that Sir Thomas had returned. He was in the house. Sir Thomas's return meant the death of the play. He had no desire at all to have all this ruckus going on, when all he wanted was peace and quiet after so long abroad, which you cannot really blame him for, honestly. So, everyone's lives got back to normal. The Crawford siblings were introduced to Sir Thomas, and even he noticed that his eldest daughter Maria seemed far more in love with Henry Crawford than with her fiancé. Julia, however, was agitated and held a clear resentment. Luckily for everyone, Henry Crawford soon left to go and visit his uncle in Bath. This is when Sir Thomas asked Maria if she's really sure about her upcoming marriage to Mr. Rushworth. If she's having second thoughts, then he can arrange for her to get out of it. Honestly, Father of the Year award to Sir Thomas. But Maria, now agitated herself for Henry leaving them, held firm in her decision, and the wedding between her and Mr. Rushworth took place that winter. Then she and her new husband went away to Brighton, and they also took younger sister Julia with them. Eldest son Tom had also left, so now it was only Fanny and Edmund of the younger generation at Mansfield Park. And, being the only young lady present, Fanny began receiving a lot more attention, in particular from her uncle, Sir Thomas, who, up until that point, hadn't really bothered with her much. But he had been away nearly 2 years, and in that time, Fanny had grown up into a pretty and modest young woman. And she began feeling like a valued family member, as opposed to before, when she was basically just part of the furniture. Her two aunts, Lady Bertram and Mrs. Norris, however, did not seem to notice and continued to treat her like their personal errand girl. So one day, when she was out on an errand for Mrs. Norris, Fanny got stuck in a rain shower. As she was close to the parsonage, she was invited inside to wait out the rain with Mary Crawford. Now, Mary had suffered greatly since so many people, including her own brother, had left the village. She was a social butterfly and hated the quiet that followed their departure. So she welcomed Fanny with open arms, and the two began hanging out every 2 or 3 days for the following weeks. As the two girls were out walking one day, they were joined by Edmund and Mary's sister, Mrs. Grant. But soon enough, Mary and Edmund got into a little argument again, as Mary said she intended on marrying rich, and strongly hinted at Edmund that he didn't qualify. Edmund defended himself, saying that he didn't exactly plan on being poor, but it all just looks like a manipulation attempt from Mary to get Edmund to abandon his plans on becoming a clergyman. The issue is dropped, and both Fanny and Edmund are invited to come to dinner at the parsonage the next evening. Now, this was a big deal to Fanny. She had never had a personal dinner invitation before. She was usually never invited anywhere, so she was quite excited about it. Her aunt, Mrs. Norris, however, did not seem to approve. She was always bullying Fanny in some way or another, reminding her of her low status and that
she shouldn't be allowed to have the carriage. She should walk there.
Honestly, Mrs. Norris is so cruel. Thankfully, Sir Thomas wouldn't hear of it and gladly offered Fanny the carriage. Fanny was so grateful, it moved her to tears, which just shows how neglected she had been up until this point. Even the tiniest gesture is incredibly moving to her. Once she and Edmund arrived at the dinner, Fanny was surprised to find that Henry Crawford had returned to his sisters. He made some comment about her cousin Maria being too good for her new husband, Rushworth, and Fanny really disliked him for it. Even though people generally agreed with this sentiment, it isn't proper to say these things out loud. The conversation then moved on to Edmund and him taking orders in a couple of weeks. He was to be offered a living worth £700 a year, which Henry pointed out was very good for a younger son. But this subject had Mary very annoyed. She felt like Edmund couldn't possibly love her if he agreed to settle for something that he knew she would never accept. And she decided that from here on, she will not encourage him any longer. The next day, Henry told his sister that he planned on staying in Mansfield a couple more weeks, and that, to amuse himself, he had decided to make Fanny fall in love with him. Mary scolded him for his wicked little plan, but she knew her brother's playboy ways all too well to know that there was nothing she could do to change his mind. Shortly afterwards, Fanny got a long-awaited visit from her older brother William. She hadn't seen him for years, and she was very excited about him coming. William was in the Navy, so he didn't have a lot of free time. That evening, he told them all stories about his life as a sailor, impressing both his uncle Sir Thomas as well as Henry Crawford. He was hoping to get a promotion soon, and he was working very hard for that, but it was very difficult for someone with a poor background. During the course of the evening, Henry did put on the charm for Fanny, which was not at all welcome on her part. But given all the attention, she found it necessary to at least be civil to him in return. This attention continued as the two families went on socializing. And one night, as the Mansfield Park family were invited to dine at the parsonage, Sir Thomas notices Henry's attention to Fanny and thinks it's a good match. That night, Fanny's brother William makes the off comment that he has never seen his sister dance, which sparks the idea in Sir Thomas to host a ball at Mansfield Park. As all of this is going on, Henry notices what a sweet girl Fanny really is, how genuine and attentive and graceful she is, and he starts to fall for her. Fanny is of course very excited about the upcoming ball, as she had never attended one before. Her aunt, Mrs. Norris, however, made rude remarks about how undeserving Fanny was of such a gesture, especially since Sir Thomas and Lady Bertram's own daughters were not even at home. Meanwhile, Edmund was starting to have doubts about Mary. He was in love with her and wanted to propose, but she disagreed with him on so many important things, which might result in her rejecting him. But when Mary gives Fanny a golden necklace to wear at the ball, Edmund is overjoyed by her generosity and seems to forget his doubts for a while. He had, in fact, bought Fanny a necklace himself, but he insisted that she should wear the one from Mary instead. Sensing Edmund's love for Mary, Fanny felt like it was a stab in her heart. Mary was completely wrong for him. But her thoughts are soon taken over by nerves. It was time for the ball, and Mansfield Park was flooded with distinguished guests. As the ball was held in her honor, Sir Thomas introduced Fanny to a lot of people, completely overwhelming her. Henry was there, of course, and was quick to secure Fanny as a partner for the first two dances. She also dances twice with Edmund, and it was in general a very agreeable night. Apart from Edmund and Mary having yet another disagreement about his ordination plans, which were to take place in a couple of days. The next morning, both Fanny's brother William as well as Henry left together for London, and shortly after that, Edmund left as well to go and finish his ordination. During their absence, there was peace and quiet at Mansfield. The one person who does not like peace and quiet is Mary Crawford. She was angry at Edmund for not changing his mind about his chosen occupation, and yet she missed him greatly and would talk about him with Fanny quite a lot, trying to figure out if there were any other women that he might be interested in. A little while later, Henry returns from London and he brings some exciting news. While in London, he had brought Fanny's brother William to meet some influential people and managed to procure him a promotion that he had so longed for. William was now finally a lieutenant. Henry had come to Mansfield Park early in the morning, meeting Fanny in the breakfast room. He showed her the letters that confirmed this, and she was beyond excited for her brother. But then he switched gears and began to proclaim his love for her, ending up in asking her to marry him. Fanny is much distressed by this, thinking that it's some sort of a cruel joke, and flees the room just as her uncle came in. She didn't tell anyone what had happened and went on to avoid Henry as he was back there for dinner that night. That following day, however, the matter could no longer be ignored. Henry came back in the early morning, formally asking Sir Thomas for Fanny's hand in marriage. Her uncle then came up to the schoolroom, where Fanny was hiding, telling her what a good match this was. Fanny still refused, saying that she doesn't like him, after which Sir Thomas went on to scold her, calling her selfish and ungrateful. After all, her marrying Henry would give her the means to help her own family, such as the Bertrams had done for her. And Fanny cried a lot over this, which you cannot really blame her for, I guess. After dinner that night, she was forced to see Henry one-on-one to explain her refusal, which didn't exactly go as she had hoped. Rather than accepting it, her refusal seemed to make Henry even more stubborn. He seemed determined to convince her and saw it as a challenge to win her heart. Henry's perseverance made Fanny quite angry, especially given how everyone seemed to be on his side. Well, apart from Mrs. Norris, who didn't think Fanny deserved such a good match. Even Edmund, who returned, now a fully fledged man of the church, approved of the match. He just thought that Fanny needed some time to, fall in love with him. As Fanny was already secretly in love with Edmund, you can imagine what she thought of this advice. As socializing continued, and Edmund now got to see for himself how devoted Henry was to his cousin. And Fanny even seemed to be warming up to him a bit. She did enjoy listening to his reading of Shakespeare one night after dinner. So Edmund keeps pushing for her to give him a chance, but Fanny is obstinate. She saw enough of his behavior during the whole play shenanigans to know his true character, that he gave in to every flirtatious whim that caught his fancy, and was therefore not to be trusted. Edmund disliked her mentioning the play, saying that they all behaved with questionable morals then, apart from Fanny, of course, and that she shouldn't hold that against him. The time eventually came for both Mary and Henry to leave Mansfield, and Fanny only saw Mary once before their departure. Mary was kind towards her despite her rejecting her brother, and explained that the necklace she had given her for the ball was all Henry's idea. They say their goodbyes, and Fanny is even a little emotional over her leaving. After the Crawfords' departure, Fanny grows increasingly fearful of Edmund's marrying Mary. She didn't deserve him, and they had nothing in common. And she got very sad by the revelation that Edmund was planning on going to London to see her, which could only mean one thing. Fanny soon got something else on her mind. Her brother William came back to Mansfield Park as they were to travel to Portsmouth together, where Fanny was to spend a couple of months with her parents and other siblings, whom she hadn't seen since she was 9 years old. So, after some emotional goodbyes, Fanny and William set off on their journey. They arrived in Portsmouth the next day, and Fanny was, let's say, surprised at the welcome she received. Her mother showed a mild interest in her, whereas her father showed practically none, and he also smelled of alcohol. There was a lot of noise in the cramped little house, and the younger children were unruly and disrespectful. On top of that, William had to leave as soon as they arrived, as the ship was to set off 3 days earlier than initially planned. So she was left alone with family who were like strangers to her. It did not take long for Fanny's disappointment to set in. Her father was always drunk and loud, and the young children were equally as loud. Everything was just loud. There was no peace, order, or sense of routine. Her mother complained all day about everything that was wrong in the house, and yet never making an effort to change things. By the end of the first week there, Fanny was so miserable that even a letter from Mary Crawford was exciting to her. Mary told of all the happenings in London and how Fanny's cousins, Maria and Julia, had also arrived there as well. Just some gossip and things of that nature. Lady Bertram also sent a letter telling of Edmund having gone to London as well, so Fanny began dreading hearing the news of his engagement to Mary. Fanny's one consolation in Portsmouth ended up being her 14-year-old sister, Susan. Susan was a sweet girl who was eager to learn, so Fanny began tutoring her with the help of books from the local library. But overall, Fanny was very unhappy there and wanted to go back to Mansfield as soon as possible. When Fanny had been in Portsmouth for about 4 weeks, an unexpected visitor arrived. Fanny came downstairs and was shocked to find none other than Henry Crawford in the sitting room. Fanny was ashamed to have him see her humble origins and was happy that her drunk father wasn't at home. Then, of course, she felt even more ashamed for thinking of her family this way. Henry, however, was very well-mannered, and Fanny welcomed him, taking her and Susan for a walk. To Fanny's horror, they ran into her father in town. Somehow she preferred his unwanted attentions over having him driven away by her vulgar relatives. But thankfully, her father behaved well, and they all walked together to the dockyard. Henry spoke of some charity he was conducting at his home estate, Everingham, which Fanny very much approved of, so all in all it was a nice conversation. Henry was staying at a local inn and met up with the family again for church the next day. Afterwards, they went on another walk, and Fanny really enjoyed herself. Henry was much improved, and she found that they enjoyed the same type of scenery and talking of Mansfield Park, which was her favorite subject. Henry notices how Fanny's spirits are low, and he says that should she wish to return home sooner than planned, she would only have to say the word to Mary, and they will personally pick her up and take her back to Mansfield. Henry then left as he had to get back to London, but you could definitely say that Fanny's impression of him was changing. Things then went back to normal, with Fanny tutoring Susan. Mary sent another letter of London gossip, but no news came of Edmund. Fanny couldn't help but think that if she could return Henry's feelings and marry him, then it would be in her power to help Susan in the same way that her aunt and uncle had helped her. Henry was a charitable man, and she was sure that he wouldn't mind an arrangement like that. So you could definitely say that she was warming up to him. 7 weeks into her stay in Portsmouth, Fanny received a letter from Edmund. She braced herself, thinking that this was the engagement announcement, but the contents were equally as surprising as they were distressing. He was back at Mansfield, but had seen Mary in London. Their differences seemed to persist. Edmund blamed Mary's ambition and materialistic views on the influence of her shallow friends, but held firm that she was still the only girl he could see himself marrying. So he hoped to be able to change her somehow. He also said that Sir Thomas would come and collect Fanny himself, but not until after Easter, and that his mother, her aunt, Lady Bertram, missed her very much and talked of her every hour. Fanny was quite upset by this, as it meant that she would have to stay in Portsmouth a lot longer than planned. Her distress soon got even worse, as Lady Bertram sent another letter only a few days later. It seemed that the eldest son, Tom, had been out partying in London one night and contracted some serious illness, and Edmund had gone there to bring him home. Fanny is updated by frequent letters as the days turned into weeks. Tom's illness was quite severe and had caused some issues with his lungs, but at least he was home. Easter came and went, and Fanny assumed that Tom's illness must have delayed Sir Thomas's travel plans. Then she gets another letter from Mary, the first in several weeks, where she asks about Tom Bertram. She even went as far as saying that if he dies, then Edmund will be a worthy heir of Mansfield Park. Truly, very insensitive, and Fanny is literally disgusted by her words. Mary then repeats her brother's offer of them taking her back home themselves, should she wish it, an offer which Fanny found very tempting. But she did not want to bring Mary anywhere near Edmund, so she declined. A week later, she gets another distressing letter from Mary. She warned Fanny about some terrible rumors floating about regarding Henry, but she urged Fanny not to believe it and that Henry was blameless. It wasn't long before this question mark was answered, as her father read in the newspaper about a scandal in London involving Mrs. Rushworth, meaning Fanny's cousin Maria, and Henry Crawford. Maria had allegedly left her husband in London and gone out in the countryside with Henry. It was too shocking to believe, but Fanny knows that where there's smoke, there's usually fire. More days went on without any news, and Fanny grew restless and even more homesick. On the third day, a letter from Edmund told of him coming for her already the next day, and even better, she could bring Susan with her home, at least to stay for a couple of months. When Edmund arrived, he not only confirmed the scandalous rumors to be true, he also told her even more shocking news. Her other cousin, Julia, had eloped to Scotland with none other than Mr. Yates, who set up the theatre at Mansfield Park. So the family was all in an uproar. Fanny, Edmund, and Susan's arrival was a relief to everyone, except Mrs. Norris. She blamed Fanny for the whole ordeal with Maria and Henry.
If Fanny had just accepted Henry's proposal, none of this would have happened.
Fanny then learned the details of what had transpired in London. Apparently, Maria and Henry had been seen together in the same social circle, and their public behavior alone was enough to spark some rumors. But then, as Henry disappeared on the same day as Maria left her husband, everyone could put two and two together. It wasn't exactly discreet. Then Julia's elopement had added even more misery. Sir Thomas and Edmund had gone to London to try and figure everything out, and that's when Edmund had seen Mary again. They had a serious talk about her brother and his sister, and Edmund was shocked by how Mary saw the whole thing. She called it folly and thought that them getting caught was worse than the actual behavior. And then she went as far as to blame Fanny too. He knew now that she wasn't at all the woman he thought she was, and left. Now, the book tells us what happened in the months following these events. First of all, it had turned out better than they feared regarding Julia's elopement. Mr. Yates's fortune was actually higher than his debts. So, all was all right there, after all. Tom recovered from his illness, but had learned a valuable lesson and became more responsible going forward. Edmund slowly healed from his heartbreak, and eventually realized that Fanny would make a good wife. Yeah. So they got Sir Thomas's blessing and got married. Even Lady Bertram was okay with it, given that young Susan took Fanny's place as her companion. So Susan's stay at Mansfield became permanent, to everyone's satisfaction. As for Henry Crawford, he and Maria lived together in sin for a while, and Mr. Rushworth divorced her. Maria refused to leave him and wanted him to marry her. But Henry grieved the loss of Fanny, and his resentment grew. He had acted upon an impulse brought on by his own selfish vanity, and he regretted it bitterly. Eventually, he and Maria parted ways in equal hatred of each other. The only one in Maria's family who were willing to defend her was Mrs. Norris, who still blamed Fanny for everything. So Norris and Maria moved abroad together, and thus the family were finally rid of them both. The end. Number 1. Let's get the controversy over with. It's really disappointing that the romance is between first cousins. Reminder, his mother and her mother are sisters. When I realized that it wasn't going to be Henry, I held out hope all the way to the last page that they wouldn't actually get married. I wanted it to end with Sir Thomas adopting Fanny instead, thus making her and Edmund legal siblings, and raising her status significantly. But alas, it was not to be. What is even worse is that Edmund and Fanny already have a sibling-like relationship. This is mentioned several times throughout the story, and that he said goodbye to her with brotherly affection, and he even refers to her as a sister at one point. So yes, big disappointment there. I couldn't ship these two because it was completely anticlimactic. However, I did enjoy the book overall. The whole Henry and Mary Crawford drama was quite entertaining to read, and for a while it did look as if Henry was gonna be the one. He made a conscious effort to change, and she was starting to like him a bit. I was even foolish enough to think that the rumor and gossip article in the paper was all some big misunderstanding, and that he would show up at the last minute with some excellent alibi or excuse, and Fanny and him would go on to get to know each other better, and she would eventually fall in love with him once he's proven that he's a changed man. My imagination was vivid enough to believe anything as long as Fanny didn't marry Edmund. Did you come and play? Oh, it's okay. So, I think there's something very Willoughby-like about Henry Crawford. By the way, if you haven't seen my Sense and Sensibility video, I encourage you to do so. I'll leave a link to it in the description. Both are villains of a similar fate. They lost the one woman they truly loved because of choices based on selfishness. That is what's so intriguing about Jane Austen novels, as the stories could have a completely different ending if it weren't for one or two specific choices. Had Henry resisted his temptations and continued courting Fanny, he would eventually have succeeded. She was already warming up to him. While I do agree that Henry is of course responsible for his own actions, you could just as easily blame it on his sister. Mary was always scheming, and she insisted on having Henry stay in London for a particular party where she knew Mr. and Mrs. Rushworth would be. She wanted to see what would happen when these people were in the same room together again. Overall, you could say that every single character in this story is selfish to some degree. Even Fanny and Edmund, who are portrayed as holier than thou. Fanny declines a very advantageous marriage proposal that could give her the power to help her family from poverty. I know she didn't love him, but back in those days, People married for far less, with or without love. And Edmund is basically a groomer and a clergyman. Quite the ironic combination, isn't it? But to end on a more light-hearted note, we also have a cast of side characters that really make the story shine. Mrs. Norris is so mean to Fanny, it really enforces the whole Cinderella narrative and makes you sympathize with Fanny. Then we have Lady Bertram, the senior lady of Mansfield Park, who should be standing up for Fanny and be a mother figure to her. But she's so weak-minded and so in need of guidance herself that it ended up being the other way around. All the characters in the story somehow contribute to Fanny turning out the way that she did, which is so fascinating to analyze. But now I want to know what all of you watching think. Let me know any and all of your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've seen any of the TV or movie adaptations, let me know what you think of those as well, as I will be watching one or two. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, as it really helps me out. Thank you all so much for watching today, and I hope to see you back next time.